So here goes. I ghosted my fiancée. Yeah, I know. It's not something I'm proud of, but I just vanished on her after she brought up, out of nowhere, the idea of an open relationship right before we were supposed to get married. Honestly, I've been wrestling with how to share this story in a way that makes sense. It's complicated, and, well, I've rewritten it multiple times, hoping to condense it, but our history stretches all the way back to when we were kids. Anyway, I'm putting it all out there, and I could really use some advice on what to do when I get back home in 2 days. Names have obviously been changed, and, seriously, I apologize in advance for the sheer length of this thing. Jan and I go way back. Like, all the way back to our childhood. We grew up together because our parents were practically inseparable, the kind of lifelong friends who did everything together, from family barbecues to vacations. So naturally, Jan and I were always in each other's lives. As we got older, our families practically had this unspoken expectation that we'd end up together, like it was written in the stars or something. It felt like our relationship was this big, intertwined plan, more for our families than for us. When we hit our teenage years, we started dating. It just seemed like the natural progression of things, given our history. But even back then, it felt like we were following a script that had already been written for us, you know? Still, we cared about each other a lot. There was genuine affection there, but it was wrapped up in everyone else's dreams and expectations for our future. Anyway, life happened. When it came time for college, I went off to pursue my master's degree in a different city, while Jen stayed behind in our hometown to work on her nursing degree. We did the long-distance relationship thing for about a year. It was hard, really hard, and eventually, we both realized the strain wasn't worth it. So we had a serious, heart-to-heart conversation and agreed to remain friends, to let go of the romantic relationship so we wouldn't feel so boxed in by it. Honestly, it felt like a relief at the time. We went our separate ways romantically but stayed best friends. Even while dating other people, there was always this weird underlying knowledge that our relationship was just, well, temporary. That one day, inevitably, we'd find our way back to each other. It was a bizarre but unspoken truth. I ended up graduating and stayed in the city where I'd gotten my degree. The job market was better there, so I started working in my field, and the plan was always to wait for a transfer that would bring me back home. I waited and waited. When the transfer finally came through, I was ecstatic. Going home felt like a dream finally coming true. But by then, Jen was in a serious long-term relationship. Her boyfriend at the time was a decent guy, at least from what I could tell, but it was always clear that he felt uneasy about our deep, lifelong friendship. It was understandable. The dynamic between Jen and me would make anyone feel threatened, so I kept my distance out of respect. Still, Jen and I would catch up a few times a year. Meanwhile, I'd started to get really close with my boss and mentor, Paul. Paul was this larger-than-life character in his mid-40s, the kind of guy who knew everyone and everything. He'd taken me under his wing from day one, and we developed this strong bond. One day, in his typical dramatic fashion, he descended from his fancy office and called me in for a chat. Paul explained there was an opportunity opening up in a foreign city, a 2-year contract that would be advertised soon. He laid out all the details for me. The pay wasn't spectacular, but all the expenses would be covered. Rent, travel, hotels, you name it. It was, he told me, a once-in-a-lifetime chance to work in Tokyo, with occasional business trips to other major Asian cities. I spent days mulling it over, talking to my friends and parents, weighing the pros and cons. Paul kept nudging me, insisting that this was my ticket to proving myself and advancing in my career. He even told me that he'd done something similar when he was younger, and it had skyrocketed his professional trajectory. Eventually, I figured, why not? I'd get to save most of my salary, gain some incredible experience, and see a part of the world I'd never explored before. And so I went. The first year was brutal, not gonna lie. Adjusting to Japanese culture and the strict social etiquette was overwhelming, to say nothing of the travel. My job required frequent visits to other countries in Asia, and it was a wild ride, to put it mildly. I'd never been so far out of my comfort zone. But something unexpected happened too. Women. Lots of women. The attention I got as a foreigner was unreal, and, well, It felt like I'd stumbled into a whole new world. I got involved with more women than I ever imagined, but I always made sure to be upfront about my intentions. I didn't want anything serious. I told every FWB I had that I was only in Asia for a short while, and marriage or commitment was not on the table. And there were a lot of women, educated, sophisticated women. This wasn't the image people typically have of hooking up abroad. These were accomplished women who knew what they wanted, and yeah, I indulged in the experience. My 2-year contract became 3. Paul would fly over a few times a year, both for work and for vacation. We had some wild adventures in places like Angeles City in the Philippines. Honestly, it was kind of insane how reckless we were. By the time I got home, I had enough stories to fill a book. I also had enough savings to put a significant down payment on a house just outside the city. After living in a metropolis with 37 million people, I desperately craved some breathing room. I wanted a quieter life, or so I thought. Being back home felt surreal. I'd only been there for about a month when, during a visit to my parents, I ran into Jen. The timing felt almost fated. She had ended her long-term relationship a year earlier, and we started talking, really talking. Our casual conversations turned serious, and it felt like we were picking up where we'd left off, but with years of growth and change behind us. We started dating again. And here's the thing, even though I really wanted to be with her physically, I held back at first. Part of me was terrified. The lifestyle I'd led in Asia had changed me, and I knew it. I'd become accustomed to variety, to having a buffet of options, and I was scared that those desires would sabotage what Jen and I were trying to rebuild. It felt like trying to tame a beast inside of me. Now, everyone knew about my past dating life, including Jen. My social media presence didn't hide it. There were occasional photos of me with different women, and while I never overshared, the hints were there. My mom even called me a whim once or twice, half joking, but it hurt all the same. So here's where things start to fall apart. Eventually, Jen and I did sleep together, and she was shocked. I mean, she noticed how different I was, how much experience I'd gained. She asked me about it, and, well, I wasn't completely honest. I trickle-truthed her, giving her enough to satisfy her curiosity, but not the full, ugly truth. Even if I had cut down the number of women I'd been with by half, it still would have been frightening. But I knew in my heart that I was committed to her, that I could be faithful. What I didn't realize was how deeply that little seed of doubt had been planted in her mind. Our families were ecstatic that we were back together. It was like their dream was finally coming true, and that excitement was contagious. After getting her parents' blessing, I proposed. Jen moved in, and life felt good, mostly. Occasionally, she'd ask me if I was truly happy with her. I brushed off those questions, thinking it was just wedding stress. Then came December 2019. We were deep into wedding planning, with everything set for June 2020. And of course, the world fell apart in early 2020. But before that disaster, something even more catastrophic happened between us. It was right before New Year's. Christmas had been wonderful, and we were just coasting, making plans for the future. One evening, I was at my computer, working on something, while Jen and her cousin Tammy were at the dining table, looking at wedding plans. Now Tammy and I also go way back. She's Jen's cousin, but we'd all grown up together, so we were pretty close. Jen suddenly asked if we could talk. Tammy shifted to the living room, and Jen took a deep breath before telling me not to interrupt or freak out. I knew something big was coming. And then she dropped the bomb. She started talking about how different I was in bed, how it felt like I had too much experience now. She said she was afraid I'd eventually get bored with her and cheat. She was worried that our future children and our life together would be ruined if I couldn't stay satisfied. I was gearing up to defend myself when she hit me with an even bigger shock. She asked if we could open our relationship. She said she wanted to gain more experience herself, so she wouldn't feel so insecure, and she swore up and down that I was the only man she'd ever truly loved. She said none of her past relationships had worked out because of the feelings she had for me. It wasn't just that she was suggesting an open relationship. She had rules prepared. Only random people. No one we knew, no emotional attachments, and never the same person twice. I thought it was a joke. Like it had to be. But she was dead serious. When I realized that, my heart practically stopped. I lost it. I yelled at Tammy, asking if she'd put Jen up to this. Tammy, looking uncomfortable, said she was just there for support. That didn't help. Then Jen told me I could do the same, with the same rules. But I didn't want that. I was furious and said I didn't want random one-night stands. I only wanted one person. Jen asked, "Who?" And in a moment of pure anger, I looked at Tammy and said, "I want to F***CK Tammy." It was a low, nasty thing to say, and it shocked both of them. Jen was horrified, and Tammy turned beet red. Jen yelled that Tammy was family, and that what I had suggested was disgusting. At that moment, it felt like everything had flipped upside down. We were living in some twisted, bizarro world. We argued and argued, the fight spiraling out of control, and I finally told Jen that if she went through with this, it was over. I couldn't handle it. I stormed off, grabbed my pillow, and slept in the guest room. From there, I could hear them talking downstairs, but I couldn't make out the words. It would have been almost laughable, a ridiculous misunderstanding, if it hadn't been real. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I dragged myself into work, feeling like a walking corpse. Jen started her 2-week night shift, and I was relieved. At least we'd have some space. She left dinner in the fridge every night with little "I love you" notes, and she'd text me regularly. But I kept my replies cold, one-word responses, because I was still seething. Then, about a week and a half into her night shift, something strange happened. I was on the computer, sorting through some files, and noticed a notification on her email. It was a confirmation for a hotel reservation, a fancy hotel near my office. I knew the place well, having been there with coworkers for happy hour. At first, I thought maybe she was planning a surprise to make things up to me, but then she texted, acting normal, saying she had just one more night shift left. But why the hotel reservation then? I felt sick, a heavy pit forming in my stomach. All day at work, I was a wreck. I even started browsing dating sites, looking at anonymous profiles, trying to see if there was a trace of her somewhere, but there was nothing. Paul dropped by my office, saw the state I was in, and insisted we go get lunch. I poured out the whole story, and he listened, nodding thoughtfully. Paul's always been one of Jen and my biggest supporters, so hearing this must have shocked him. Then, in typical Paul fashion, he suggested something drastic, staking out the hotel. He said we had to know the truth, even if it hurt. I didn't want to go full detective mode, but deep down, I needed answers. So there we were, sitting in the hotel bar, like two amateur sleuths, watching and waiting. I drank way too much, trying to numb the growing dread. And then, at 6:30 sharp, Paul nudged me, and there she was. Jen. At the front desk, wearing casual clothes, definitely not her work uniform. My whole world collapsed. I felt a surge of emotions, rage, heartbreak, disbelief. We waited for a few minutes after she took the elevator, then approached the front desk. I asked the receptionist to connect me to Jen's room, and when she picked up, I let out all the pain and fury I'd been holding in. I screamed into the phone, telling her I was done, that the wedding was off, and we were finished. She tried to respond, but I didn't want to hear it. I slammed the phone down and walked out, feeling shattered. Where did I go? Straight to Paul's. My phone was blowing up, but I only made one call, to my dad. I explained, in the simplest terms possible, what had happened and that I needed to leave town. I didn't give him a choice. For 2 days, I didn't pick up my phone. Messages and calls poured in from everyone, but I couldn't face it. I felt like I was drowning. Paul, always practical, reminded me to handle the financial fallout. The house, the wedding fund, the car loans. We had separate finances, but there were still things to sort out. But I just couldn't bring myself to care. I eventually sent Jen one last email, telling her this would be our final contact, that I was leaving and that everything was off. Then I called my dad back, and we had a long, painful talk. He was heartbroken, but understood that I needed to put distance between myself and the mess I was in. 10 days later, I got on a plane and flew to Bali. For a month, I lived in a haze, drinking too much and barely functioning. I stayed off the grid, only checking in with my dad and work. Paul suggested I go back to Tokyo, and with the whole world locking down, I did. What I thought would be a short 30 to 60-day trip turned into over a year. By the time I got vaccinated, I didn't even want to go home. My house was rented out, and I still refused to hear any updates about Jin. Then, in September, everything changed. My dad had a heart attack. He was stable but needed serious surgery, and I knew I had to go home. Facing everything I'd run from was unavoidable, and I was terrified. But I boarded the plane, knowing the storm that awaited me. Landing back home felt like stepping into a storm I'd been running from for way too long. The first thing I did was head straight to the hospital to see my dad. Seeing him lying there, hooked up to all these machines, was like a punch to the gut. But somehow, he looked okay. Hopeful even. He told me he was optimistic about the surgery, even joking about finally getting some new pipes put in. My mom was there too, doing her best to put on a brave face, though her worry was pretty obvious. We spent almost the entire day together. I didn't want to leave his side, so we talked for hours about everything under the sun. Sports, old family stories, random memories that made us laugh. We stayed away from anything heavy. I didn't want to stress him out any more than he already was. I promised him I'd be there for whatever he needed, and he could tell I meant it. That first night back was emotionally exhausting, and I knew it was only the beginning. There was so much I needed to face: my dad's health, reconnecting with people I'd lost touch with, and, of course, the elephant in the room, Jin. And it was only a matter of time before I'd have to deal with her. The next day, I decided to bite the bullet and head into the office for the first time in what felt like forever. Walking in was surreal. Some people I'd known for years were gone, replaced by new faces. The energy was different, but it was comforting to see a few familiar coworkers still around. People nodded at me and offered quick greetings, but it felt like I was a ghost in a place I used to call home. Paul greeted me like no time had passed. He whisked me straight up to see the old man, our boss, whom I'd never really spoken to directly before. The old man was a legend in our company, the kind of guy who only made appearances when absolutely necessary. He was all business when we walked in, launching into a long-winded rant about responsibility, dedication, and how the company needed people who were willing to give 110%. It felt like he was tearing into me, and I could feel the anxiety building. Then, he turned to Paul and asked, "Why should we keep this kid around?" I braced myself, expecting the worst, but Paul jumped in with, "Because he does great work. He's saved accounts, brought in new ones, and honestly, we can't find anyone willing to work for 20% below market rate like he does." Wait, what? I was shocked. Before I could process that, the old man and Paul burst out laughing, like they were sharing some private joke. It was surreal. The old man even wiped a tear from his eye and said, "That's why he's the best VP I have." I felt both relieved and a bit insulted at the same time. I mean, come on, 20% below market rate? Before I could react, the old man leaned in and gave me this intense piece of advice, quoting some philosopher or old saying I can barely remember now. God gives a woman eyebrows, and she plucks them out and draws on new ones. God gives her a face, and she paints a new one over it. God gives her a form, and she buys slim-fitting clothes to change that form. If God himself cannot satisfy her, how can you, brother? Please don't kill yourself over it. It kind of blew my mind. I sat there, stunned, and the old man looked at Paul. "Can I trust you to handle this?" he asked. "Your mother would kill me if I had to fire him." It was then I realized they were related. My jaw almost hit the floor. Paul clapped me on the back as we left, and I finally asked, 20% below market, really?" He just laughed, put his arm around me, and said, "Don't worry about that. I've got you covered." I asked, "So am I getting fired or something?" Paul shook his head. "No, dumbass. You're getting promoted." And then, in true Paul fashion, he kissed me on the side of the head and laughed at my confusion. He'd missed me, he said, and then suggested we go celebrate. At 8:30 in the morning. Only Paul. We ended up getting a little drunk, as one does when Paul is involved. We talked about everything, work, life, the whole mess with Jin. Paul was still my biggest supporter, despite everything, and he told me I needed closure with Jin. He said that until I faced the pain, I wouldn't be able to move forward. He was right, of course. So later that day, I unblocked Jin on Facebook. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through her profile, trying to prepare myself for whatever emotional gut punch was coming. I finally sent her a message, asking if we could meet for dinner. She replied, and we exchanged polite, almost robotic pleasantries. We set a date. The day of the dinner came, and I was a wreck. My mind was racing. Was I going to be angry? Would the love I used to feel for her come rushing back? I didn't know how I'd react. When she walked into the restaurant, looking beautiful as ever, my heart lodged itself in my throat. We shared a brief, awkward hug. She smelled like the perfume I'd always loved. I braced myself for whatever was about to happen. We started with small talk. She asked about my dad, and I was touched to hear she'd been checking in on him during her shifts at the hospital. We talked about the pandemic, her workload, my experiences being locked down in Tokyo. It was civilized. Painful, but civilized. Beneath the surface, I was a storm of emotions, barely holding it together. Finally, she brought up the past. Her face changed, and she apologized, deeply and sincerely. I asked her if she was sorry for getting caught or truly sorry for the pain she caused. She assured me it was the latter. She explained that her actions were driven by insecurity, but also maybe a desire to punish me for my past. It stung to hear, but I appreciated her honesty. We talked about love, about how she had never loved anyone the way she loved me. She even told me that her ex, Tim, had cheated on her because he couldn't handle how much she loved me. That was news to me, and it hit hard. Jen admitted she'd thought she could emotionally detach from what she had planned, but she realized too late that she'd been wrong. I asked, "Can you forgive me?" And I told her, "Of course I can forgive you. But forgiving you doesn't mean I can forget what happened, or that we can go back to how things were." It was a brutal truth. I told her I never needed perfection from her. I just needed her to be mine. Then she did something I wasn't expecting. She took out the engagement ring box and slid it across the table. My heart ached. I told her I didn't want it back, that I was angry, and that I wanted the future we'd planned. The home, the family, the life that was now just a broken dream. I even let slip that I imagined us playing with the child we'd have by now. Jen broke down, sobbing into her hands, and I knew I'd gone too far. I apologized, and the rest of the conversation softened. We talked about the future, about how our parents were like second families to each other, and how we'd have to navigate that. Reconciliation was off the table, but we discussed how we could coexist. As she got up to leave, we hugged, and it felt like a final goodbye. I'll write more tomorrow. It's been an emotionally draining few days, and I'm still processing everything.